James Wilson thought he was just defending Eric Johnson, but soon realized the case would challenge everything he believed in. A corrupt cop, a fabricated crime, and a choice that could cost him everything. How James uncovered the truth will shock you. But let's start from the beginning. James Wilson, a successful black prosecutor, had always felt the weight of the system stacked against him. Every step of his career felt like it was built on proving himself twice as hard as anyone else. But his resolve was strong, and he had earned the respect of his colleagues. Little did he know, this case would test his very belief in justice. His client, 34-year-old Eric Johnson, was facing charges for possession of illegal firearms and drugs, charges that seemed almost impossible to refute. Eric had been arrested during a routine traffic stop by Officer Mark Jennings, a cop known for his aggressive tactics and racial profiling. Jennings had filed a report claiming he found a bag of heroin in Eric's car, a bag that no one had seen before. But something didn't sit right with James. He had seen these types of cases before, cases where evidence was fabricated to frame people, particularly black men. James wasn't just a prosecutor. He was a man who had lived through the brutality of systemic racism, and he had a deep understanding of how the system could break. But he had never seen this kind of corruption up close before. It was one thing to suspect it, but it was another to be standing on the front lines of it. As he reviewed the case files, James began to notice the small inconsistencies, details in Officer Jennings' report that didn't add up. No mention of the supposed search warrant. No clear chain of custody for the evidence. He couldn't ignore the sinking feeling in his gut that something far darker was at play. Was this the moment he had been dreading? James spent the next few days digging deeper into the evidence, running background checks on the officers involved. It wasn't long before he uncovered a troubling pattern. Officer Jennings had been linked to several previous cases of racial bias and misconduct, though none of these had ever been prosecuted. It was clear, this wasn't just a bad arrest. This was part of a larger, deeply ingrained problem. By the time the trial started, James was convinced. He had to expose what was really happening, not just for his client, but for the truth. But the question remained, would the court believe him? Would they listen? Or would they let yet another black man fall victim to a system that had never truly cared about justice for people like him? The courtroom was thick with tension as James Wilson entered, his every step purposeful. Eric Johnson sat next to him, a man torn between fear and hope, his hands trembling slightly. The jury, a mix of stoic faces, already filled their seats. Across the room, Richard Sutherland, the seasoned and smug prosecutor, stood tall with the arrogance of someone confident in the system's bias. James rose, his voice steady but firm, as he began his opening statement. He told the jury plainly that his client, Eric, was innocent. The so-called evidence against him had been planted by Officer Mark Jennings. The words hung in the air, daring the system to challenge them. Then, Sutherland rose. His argument was smooth, practiced, and powerful. He painted Eric as a dangerous criminal caught red-handed, a threat to society. He spoke with the confident tone of a man who knew the jury's prejudices, relying on the weight of institutional credibility. Even James, with years of courtroom experience, felt the sting of Sutherland's rhetoric. But James wasn't deterred. When he cross-examined Officer Jennings, the cracks began to show. Jennings shifted uncomfortably, his arrogance giving way to stammering defenses as James relentlessly exposed inconsistencies in his testimony. The lies were unraveling, and with each new revelation, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. It wasn't just about winning anymore. It was about exposing the corruption that had allowed men like Officer Jennings to hide behind their badge. Every word James spoke was a risk, a challenge to a system that had long turned a blind eye to the truth. The tension grew with each passing day, as James exposed one lie after another. The stakes were high. His career, his reputation, and the fate of his client all on the line. But for James, the truth was worth the risk. The trial reached its turning point when James Wilson presented a crucial piece of evidence, a grainy video taken by a bystander who had witnessed Eric's arrest. The footage was shaky, but it was clear enough to show Officer Jennings planting a bag of drugs in Eric's car during the stop. The room fell silent as the video played, the impact of the footage sinking in. It was the smoking gun James had been searching for, the one piece of evidence that could tear apart the prosecution's case. As the video ended, the defense team scrambled, but it was already too late. Jennings, who had been sitting confidently at the witness stand, now looked visibly shaken. His face was a mixture of disbelief and mounting anger as the realization of his lies unraveling before him set in. He wiped the sweat from his brow, trying to maintain his composure, but it was clear that his credibility was gone. The courtroom, once heavy with doubt, was now buzzing with the knowledge that the truth had been exposed. James stood tall, facing the jury with unwavering conviction. "This is not just about my client," he said, his voice steady and full of resolve. "This is about every black man who has been wrongfully targeted by the police. This is about the countless lives ruined by a system that never once thought to question the word of an officer over the word of a black man." His words struck a chord in the room, and for a moment, it felt as though the weight of injustice had finally been acknowledged. Just as the judge called for a lunch recess, James was approached by a figure he hadn't noticed before. Another officer, someone he didn't recognize. The officer handed him a confidential report, a document that revealed Jennings' involvement in several other wrongful arrests. The officer had been taking bribes to plant evidence in high-profile cases. It was the breakthrough James had needed. With this, he knew he could completely destroy Jennings' credibility and take down the corrupt system that had allowed him to operate with impunity. The final day of the trial arrived, and the courtroom was packed. Tensions were high. The jury deliberated for hours, but everyone knew the outcome. The fabricated evidence had been exposed, and Officer Jennings had nowhere to hide. When the verdict was read, James felt a rush of relief and triumph. Eric was acquitted, but the victory wasn't just for his client. It was for justice itself. The case had drawn attention to the larger issue of police corruption, and soon, other cases began to come to light. Jennings was arrested, and his actions would no longer be hidden in the shadows. But for James, this was just the beginning. He knew that the fight for justice was far from over. But now, he had the strength and the courage to continue. He had exposed the truth, and in doing so, had changed the course of his life and the lives of many others. As he left the courtroom, he didn't feel the weight of the world on his shoulders anymore. He felt lighter, free. And for the first time in a long time, James believed that the system could be changed, one case at a time.